of the level of infiltration that has taken place. So, in addition to much of these crime prevention strategies, we also have to look at strengthening and increasing the integrity of the police force. Having the operations under a state of emergency has allowed us to start doing those forms of interventions and deployments in such a way that those, Mr. Speaker, who would normally compromise operations are not close to our operations. Can't just move them. We'll come to debate it, and your leader of the opposition will explain the issues. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to just bring the nation in on the complexities that the government faces in making the decisions that we have to make in finally once and for all dealing with this crime problem. Mr. Speaker, I invite the House to give its favorable, its unified consideration for the extension of the state of emergency in St. James. I thank you.
Dr. Phillips. Mr. Speaker, let me just say from the outset that we on this side place now, and indeed have always placed, the highest priority on the safety and security of every Jamaican citizen. It is for this reason that we have given full support to every measure that government has undertaken, which, despite qualms that we may have had, we have considered that on balance, they could make Jamaica a safer place to live and work and raise families and do business. We had asked for the debate on the St. James extension of the state of emergency to be separated from the St. Catherine discussion, largely because we had insisted that information that we had repeatedly requested from the government regarding the effects of the state of emergency, the results of police actions, had not been forthcoming. And I can say, and I want to express thanks to the Minister of National Security, that we have got answers to some of the questions that had been asked through the opposition spokesman on national security. You know, Mr. Speaker, Winston Churchill once remarked that there are lies, damn lies, and statistics. And the issue here is not so much the data that has been presented, but the interpretations that we are to place on the data. The first thing I think we need to begin with, and I think all of us can accept, that we are facing in the country a massive eruption of criminal violence which has affected everyone. The Prime Minister, and we acknowledge it to be true, makes much of the fact that the murder trend is heading downwards marginally from 3-point-something, from 4.6 to 3.4. Marginally, but welcome. But it is still much higher than it was last year. and higher still than it was the year before. And the point I make is this. We need to determine what accounts for the increase in violent crime that has resulted over the last 2 years. And we need to determine what is the most effective response that the country can make in the face of this increase in violent crime. And more specifically, is a state of emergency an effective response over the long term? Now, what caused it? What caused this eruption of crime over the last couple of years? Because, for one thing, the long-term factors that the Prime Minister alludes to, the breakdown in institutional structure, the breakdown in infrastructural facilities, the breakdown in family, I think he mentioned, all of that is true. But it has been occurring for some time. It is also true that the phenomenon of gangs with international connections is not a new phenomenon. It may have gathered momentum. The Prime Minister is privy to the most up-to-date information. But make no doubt about it, the central figure in the events of 2010 was someone with vast international connections. Was not the only one. There were others in Montego Bay as well, who were arrested in 2004, and others. So this phenomenon has been around. And I think what we need to consider, Mr. Speaker, is what lessons we ought to have learned over the 10 years or so between 2005 and 2016, including 2010, and what errors have we made in that period of time. For one thing, we ought to have learned that we needed united effort as a country. And I know the Prime Minister doesn't like to hear it, but we have to keep reminding him that the effort to introduce an unpleasant political divide and spurious division in the 2016 campaign set us back. It gave fillip to those masterminds and those criminals that you point to. But it happened, let's put it to one side. I know not all words in the dictionary reach to where you were schooled. Sustenance, if you prefer. But let's never go there again. Let's never go there again and impute motive. The second thing, the second lesson, I want you in particular to listen, because I believe if you put your mind to it, it can be of value. Mr. Speaker, I think we need also to learn the lesson. And it is a lesson that was of significance in the overturning of the cocaine trade, which was the last center prior to the scamming operations of today of transnational criminal activity in the country and gang activity in the country. The lesson that we learned, which we need to continue to absorb, is that intelligence-led policing is the only game in town that will give you an effective response. Intelligence-led policing. Identify through careful, sustained intelligence gathering, transform the intelligence into viable cases, arrest the individuals that are breaking the law, take them out of circulation with effective cases, and it is the only basis on which you can create an environment where peaceful law-abiding behaviors can grow. So what appears to have been the case over the past 2 years, as the crime grew, violence grew, it got out of hand, is that there was a breakdown of policing, breakdown of intelligence-led policing, which saw the mounting of this violent crime across the country. It is against that background that we have to make the assessment how effective has the state of emergency been. On one level, it has definitely assisted. We can acknowledge it. It has assisted in lowering the rate of shootings, lowering the rate of murders in St. James, and that is to be welcomed. But what aspect of it has caused this lowering? Have we dismantled the gangs? Have we been able to put the masterminds, to use the words of the Prime Minister, behind bars? The evidence doesn't suggest so. What we have, based upon the information forthcoming from the Minister of National Security, is that there are some 2,729 persons detained over the period since January 1st up to June 30th. 2,729 persons detained, of which 175 were charged. 179 persons were charged. I'm quoting from Whatcom. It says 179 persons were charged for various crimes. Now, we're talking about 6% or thereabouts of the total of those detained that were charged. And of that, remember, 25 murders, 27 illegal possession, robbery, derogation, rape. And there are others, some were charged with relatively minor offenses. The question is not whether it is good that we got the 20, but that we need to think about the 2,700 detained and the pattern of policing that implies. There's an implication because it is a pattern of policing that we have tried many times before. Because what it in effect means, and it was reported in the Gleaner story that was put on the front page, and I think I have some quotes here about from one mother, and she said, when them come into the community, them just scrape up everybody and gone. It's torture, said one woman whose son was detained. Now, it's a pattern of policing which has contributed to the breakdown of that relationship, Prime Minister, over many, many decades. We had it from we were doing Suppression of Crime Act, and we have continued. And that it is for that reason that the Constitution was amended to make the state of emergency, by definition, something of short duration, precisely because it had this capacity of constraining the rights of so many people in many drastic ways. So I want to sound, even today, the note of caution about using a state of emergency as an open-ended measure to support policing. There are other reasons why it ought not to be used over the longer term in this way. My information is, now not from the minister, but independently searched for. I can't vouch totally for its accuracy, but you're using about 600 police per week, 90 per day, 600 per month. Their working hours, they are stretched. They are stretched. And in fact, 90 per day in St. James, 600 per week. And I don't know, and the cost of the operations by your numbers now is 30. In fact, if I was to round it off, it would be 31. $31 million a month for the JCF alone. That's a bill that will come to you, and we don't know. We don't know because we were not given the JDF costs in this operation. So in the 7 months, we're looking in the order of $250 million for St. James Police alone. We're not talking about the JDF operations, and I am still told that the incentives for the police have not been paid. And I want to put in a word for the police. They are stretched. The argument is, no, I know, no, but, no, well, slow down. If you listen some more, you may learn some more. The argument is this. The issue is this. That $250 million, enhancing our intelligence gathering, using our investigative arms enhanced with additional human resources, enhanced with additional technical resources, using available legislation, could that give us the result that we need? And give us even more on top of it. Because remember, the number when we asked the minister, how many of that 125 that has been charged, 175 that has been charged, how many are gang members or gang leaders? The number is 20. So 99% of those detained, 99% of those detained are not part of the gangs and the gang leadership and the operations by the numbers given by the minister. But it is acknowledged that the gangs are who we should be going for. And I'm just saying that requires the quality of intelligence gathering that is needed, and that's where we should put the energy. Because what you're really doing now is blanket interdiction. And there's a third reason, blanket presence. There's a third reason why we should be reticent about using the state of emergency powers for a long time. If you normalize the state of emergency in the consciousness of the people, in the minds of the police, then as an everyday occurrence, then when you need it, you will have an empty toolbox. There'll be nothing left in the toolbox to give you that extra drive. It's a moral hazard. You know, when I listen to how you come through, it sounds to me that even in romance, your approach will be crude. You just want a yes or a no.
Order, please. Order. Order, please.
Mr. No, you see, it's a serious thing. We are prepared to support it. But I wish you could listen to the issues that we are raised, and don't just because it's a serious issue that the country has to grapple with, and the Prime Minister said we want cooperation. And when we come with a willingness to put our ideas, all you want is yes and no. What kind of cooperation is that? Cooperation and harmony require listening, consideration at minimum, debate, and arriving at something which we all can join up with. That's what it requires.
Dr. Phillips.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would never leave you out. One of the issues that we need to have in view ultimately is the question of, without sending any signal to any criminal or anyone else, it cannot be that we are at the point where we are saying this is the only way. And if you don't support this way, you are not in support of anti-crime measures. No sanky, no sing so. What we need is some sense of what, and the question was asked of the minister, what would be the factors that would let us know that St. James can return to normal activity? What will enable us not just to rely on the concentrated action in St. James and St. Catherine North, but that we would have, taking into account that many of these gangs, as you know, Minister, are in fact gangs with an island-wide presence that move their activities from parish to parish, town center to town center. What will enable us to know when we have degraded the major gangs? And if we don't have to know the gangs, just say we want to degrade 20%, we want to degrade 15%, we want to degrade 30%, so we can know that there is a point at which the ordinary citizens can begin to rely again on the democratic rights provided by our Constitution. Is there a clear strategic plan that will let us know that the state of emergency is going to be replaced by Zozos in a further range of areas, assuming that the Zozos, as you have said and with which we agree, is not just social intervention, because we can't do social intervention. But Zozo does not have the extent of demolition of the democratic rights of people that the state of emergency has. We can use it in other places. What is the situation with Backbush and Mountain View? No, because Mountain View, Jarrett Lane, Backbush, others, parts of it are parts of a violence, as I heard when I was overseas, that caused people to have a problem. Okay, Jarrett Lane. Jarrett Lane, all right. What about a Zozo in Southwest St. Andrew? We're not afraid. What about Zozos there? That's the type of thing. We don't, you see, the very response of the Honorable Minister highlights a concern that we have about Zozos, that people are viewing them in terms of political affiliations. That's what we don't want to have happen. No way. So, Mr. Speaker, a month ago, when the issue was raised, I believe, with St. Catherine North, we raised the question that the anti-gang legislation provides an effective means that is underutilized for degrading the gangs. There's legislation in place that allows us to meet our objectives. We were told by the Prime Minister that there were problems with implementing or effecting or optimizing the benefits of the anti-gang legislation. I did my own investigations, and all I will say is that there is many of the senior members of the security forces feel that it can deliver for them. But be that as it may, that they can and have been making some progress. Good. But where I want to make my emphasis is that we were told that we would have constituted in this House, as provided for in the legislation, the review committee, a select committee, to review it so we can make it more effective. So whether you are right or the police are right, we can get more effective utilization of the anti-gang legislation. Let us go there. We have the legislation. We must not end up using the state of emergency as just a kind of panacea, a kind of memento, an artifact that we can say, well, we have a state of emergency, it's proof we're dealing with crime. Because it requires much more. And we are not comfortable with a state of emergency lasting for a year, now going into 9 months. We are not comfortable with it. It was never intended in the circumstances of the present Constitution, and in supporting the measures, it is because we don't want to leave the security forces naked at this point in time. But put in place the measures, Mr. Speaker, for it to be done. I thank you.
Dr. Chan.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. First, let me comment on a number of things. But this government appreciates and intends to ensure that we take steps to ensure we can have unity on the issue of crime. That's our commitment and our objective. This is an issue, all right? But let me just, before commenting, I don't know, well, speaking to the issues I have. Trying to find it. Oh, yeah. First, let me make some corrections on the comments made by the leader. 600 per year, per month, would lead to 8,000 for the police per year, which would not have any force at this point. There's 600 per year, but attrition is a major problem in the police force. We recognize it, and using. Oh, well, that's long-standing. Okay. No. Yeah, well, the issue of 600 per month is not just recent to the SOE in Montego Bay. We have had that intermittently for a long time in terms of mobile reserve and pulling from around the parish. In fact, we have been as high as 700 at different times in the parish of St. James. And in order to deal with it effectively, I've just identified a problem. We are setting up the cost there largely is that much of this element of the force, the mobile reserve, was been relocated in Montego Bay, and a large block of that cost is to find them rooms. And at different times of the year, the rooms are particularly costly depending on, whether where they are available. But most rooms in Montego Bay are pretty costly, especially look at the number. It's a resort town, and you're talking hotel rooms by and large. In order to resolve this, we're already committed to establishing, starting later this year, a mobile reserve west, which will be able to accommodate on a full-time basis a station of over 250 mobile reserve police officers with appropriate accommodation in a situation which we said will be in keeping with the professionalism of the police force. We have the land, we have identified design, we're ensuring the design is modern, satisfactory, and in keeping with what I said young professionals should be accommodated in. That I think was not, and that is necessary not only to deal with emergency situation. The population of Montego Bay and the entire region has grown considerably since what you might call the establishment for the forces currently based in Montego Bay was done. And it is noticeable that much development now takes place in the north and west of the country. And the need for increased police personnel out there is critical. In more recent years, expansion in the tourism industry has been almost exponential for the last 15 years. In huge, large number of rooms are going up, increasing worker population. In the Montego Bay Freeport area alone, where the business process outsourcing services have expanded dramatically, we're looking in Freeport alone some 20,000 workers. So the demand for policing is certainly expanded significantly. In addition to that, as the tourism sector expands, you realize now resort town, you are catering not just to the 200,000 population and the expanding population in surrounding areas, but you're looking at over 1 million visitors passing through annually. Therefore, the demand for police service is crucial, and we intend to deal with that. But, Mr. Speaker, it's my intention to just point out the Prime Minister has spoken extensively on where we're coming from and what we have achieved with the state of emergency. We have no contention with the opposition, and it is the right to do so, point out some of the challenges, because let us this side understand, if you look at the police force and the history, we have been dealing with violence for a long time. In fact, I quoted an article in here, which was a 1972 article, which could have been written yesterday. It tells you that violence is endemic, and successive governments have tried different mechanisms. And we have to examine at all times what are like the best practices that can be sustainable over time. We're open to that, but we do have an acute situation as reflected in the figures given by the Prime Minister when we talk about 180 per 100,000 population. That is a crisis that's supposed to be dealt with major intervention. But I'd say again, to look back at some of the historical things, you remember the suppression of crime, that it was a piece of legislation that was accepted by the country. I was paused to mention that because it is fair to say that particular act, which was used by the police to begin the process of trying to dismantle gangs and intervene against violent producers, it may be one of the causes of the change in character of the police force, where today they are extremely, and we all agree on it, they move to operational paramilitary activity rather than deep, intense, not only intelligence-driven, but investigative activity that could seek to apprehend and lock away criminals. And we have to reverse that trend. It's not going to happen overnight. That's one of the challenges you face out there. The security forces have conducted themselves in a very professional manner in this, which allows us to be a bit more liberal in our approach to maintaining it, but we are aware that we cannot maintain that kind of a legislative, framework for too long a time. It is just not possible. But we need it still. If we examine the situation, and I know what you're asking is for more long-term sustainable activity, where are we going? Because we cannot maintain this, but it is not yet time to curtail. The question of violence is what in the public area we call endemic in Jamaica, and in particular section of the country like St. James and urban corporate area. And when you have endemicity, it takes time to remove it. You can get under control, but to ensure that it doesn't recur very quickly, it means intense, continued activity to deal with the causes and pathology of the problem. And there is no question that in any measure, and whatever you were to look at it, violence has become an endemic challenge in a number of our communities that has to be dealt with. It's almost a part of the culture of the community, and we have to design mechanisms to overcome it. And there obviously must be a two-pronged approach. What we're doing now with zones of special operations, police operations like we initiated in Savamar, Clarendon, and this areas for the state of emergency are immediate measures designed to restore control in the areas where it has gone totally out of control. These are areas of high violent areas. In addition to that, we have to use the districts we have identified for state of emergency and zones of special operation to restore confidence in the security forces. It's a factor that we cannot measure in terms of empirical numbers. But given what we are coming from, part of the problem we are faced with in areas of high violence was a loss of confidence in the security forces. And therefore, the investigative arm, even if they were competent and professional, had difficulty accumulating evidence, even where intelligence was evident, because citizens were afraid to give satisfactory information that can be treated as evidence. They felt the retaliation, they felt we could not protect them. That has become a part of the inner city culture. And therefore, you have to take time to establish in the minds of our citizens that the government of Jamaica, which means Parliament as a whole, and the security forces can now take action to protect them and restore a level of law and order in their communities. Bear in mind, we have had special operations before. You go into an area, you dismantle a gang, and you come out in 3 months, and the gang reorganize, and within a few weeks, they begin to murder citizens who they felt were cooperative with the security forces. I've seen incidents emerging from individuals who have spent nearly a decade in prison, and they return to the communities, and of course take revenge on those who they toss in the prison. So it's an important aspect of what we're doing, and the need to continue the operations to ensure we can, as I said, restore the sense of confidence by our citizens in all of this. St. James, of course, is where we are focused on today, and we have taken steps, as indicated by our plans, to ensure that some of the national events, well, 2 things. One, to remind the country of what are the normal working hours during the state of emergency, because the regulations are in place, but institutions can be allowed or can open their normal hours. For example, clubs and fast food restaurants can go until 2 a.m. 6 a.m. to 2 a.m. covers almost all day. What we have done in St. James is for the period of the 15th of July to the 22nd, we are seeking to allow for an entertainment district that would be given even some more liberal hours for the time of the national event. It will put pressure on the police, but also indicates how we can operate and ensure that events will continue in a normal way, so that while we have to maintain the characteristics of the state of emergency, we can still allow commanders who are proven to be efficient, professional, and capable to manage the areas within normal framework and begin to establish a sense of normalcy. The police force in these areas should be commended. We have to ensure that we continue the operation. Gangs, I don't want to correct one more figure, we refer to the gangs being, the figure of 20 gangs is, the way it is written, the indication to do with 20 leadership, because there are 25 active gangs in Montego Bay, and what was referred in 20 is 20 leaders of the 2,500. It is difficult to say how many of the 2,500 gangs, but they are largely affiliated individuals, but focus was placed on 20 individuals who are leaders. You must understand, a leader will control a large body and stand out and are the cause of much of the mayhem and violence in the area. So 20 of them were apprehended and charged, and 2 were killed. This is well known. Right? I said the answers I gave it to the spokesman. So, Mr. Speaker, there is no question that the government is aware of the challenges, but we have had successes. We are committed to taking long-term measures, but at this point in time, we need the continuation of the state of emergency, the zones of special operation, to ensure we can protect the citizens, maintain the positive trends in the criminal activity, and we want to assure you that actions are being taken to ensure that sustainable work will be done to ensure that when we do take the steps to lift these measures, peace will reign in the communities across Jamaica. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my intervention will be short. Mr. Speaker, as the leader of the opposition has indicated, our minister, you can go. We have indicated our commitment to support every effort towards the reduction of murder, the reduction of crime generally in the country. And I want to come back again, through you, Mr. Speaker, to the Prime Minister. The support which you ask for and which the country needs require proper and timely information, because our position must be informed by data and results. And we had served notice from the beginning of the states of emergencies and also of the ZOZO. One of the specific questions asked from the government to provide us with, what are the determined quantitative and qualitative indicators or markers for establishing success of the state of emergency in St. James? You must know what you want to achieve to determine success. Answers like reduction in murders, yes, but you always have murders. What level will give you a level of achievement for the state of emergency that we are all agree cannot be permanent and cannot be indefinite? But you must have some targets that you're working towards. It can't be more simple and straightforward than that, so that we know whether or not we are getting success or not. What is it that the security force needs to get to where it wants in terms of personnel, equipment, technology? What are those things? If we don't have them, that we need them. We know what we need. We know what we are seeking to get. We can measure whether we are achieving our goals and what we really need to get there. I'm reiterating that, Mr. Prime Minister. On the information provided, for example, regarding St. James state of emergency, of the 2,729 persons detained, 2,554 persons had to let go. And I want to raise that again, Prime Minister, because we must learn from the past, learn from our own experiences so that we don't repeat them. We, the People's National Party government, brought about the state of emergency, the Suppressions of Crime Act in the past, as a response then. We ended up had to repeal it. It never achieved the goals we wanted, and it caused certain further problems in dealing with crime fighting. We don't want to repeat that with the state of emergency. All of us will bear the consequences of such a mistake. And it is for that reason, Prime Minister, we make the appeal that the state of emergency must be seen and be pursued as a short-term measure. 9 months, 1 year can't be considered short-term. Every time we just come on repeating, and if we say no, do something, you say we're against the fight against crime and violence. We don't want 2,554 young persons who have had that experience with the police to become hostile persons to the police force. You cannot generate sustainable crime reduction going forward. And the research data indicate that those persons who have had those experiences in their communities are the ones who are disposed to become hardened opponents of law and order. We don't want to repeat those mistakes of the past, Mr. Prime Minister. So when we call on you to say, let us bring this thing to an end in the shortest possible time, it is not to reap those negative results down the road. Going forward, the data. We asked how many of that, in fact, the data we got was a bit mixed up, quite frankly. How many of those persons detained, were charged? One point is, we heard 175 of the 2,729. If there's 170, it says in the same response, 175 offenses. Now, one person can commit 10 offenses. Which is it? Is it 175 persons detained, or is it 175 offenses altogether? We're not clear. So your ability to assess success, even if you take 175 persons charge and multiple other, with each of them or some of them have multiple offenses, it is still a small percentage, less than 10%, 5% of the overall persons that have been detained. That for us is not something to celebrate about. So we need better particulars in that regard. Mr. Prime Minister, again at the beginning we said, okay, this ultimate tool in fighting crime must be a temporary one-off. What is it that is being done for the long term? I would want to believe, Mr. Prime Minister, things that are within our reach, or they say hanging fruits. The question of incarcerated persons who are directing criminal activities out there. It is an ongoing concern. I'm going to keep on talking about it over and over and over until it is dealt with, because it's going to remain a continuing contributor to the problem. There's no point in arresting or apprehending gang leaders, Minister, and put them in jail, and yet they can direct murders and extortion and other criminal activities out there. I hear you speak much, Prime Minister, about the international network. It is to control the impact of those persons externally on criminal activities in Jamaica. Why can't we control those that we have incarcerated? If we can't demonstrate the capacity, the will to control those who we lock up, how are we going to try to control those that are beyond our borders? What confidence we give the Jamaican people that we are really serious about dealing with those elements that are behind these criminal activities in Jamaica? Those must be doable things, Mr. Prime Minister. Don't tell us that we can't do it. And so far we have not been doing it. For over 2 years, since the state of emergency started in January, I've been preaching about it. It remains. And I know that there are a number of persons living in fear on a daily basis from these persons. So much so that they don't even want to give information to the police about activities taking place out of fear that those persons will have an impact on them. Mr. Prime Minister, those are the things that we need some answers to. I would have believed, Mr. Prime Minister, that during the state of emergency, 7 months going 9 months when it is the time that you ask for, you get it in St. James, I would want to believe that we want to have St. James, after the state of emergency, as a place that people can feel safe. Public order and public safety would remain. I said in my sectoral debate, the CCTV, which has been renamed, branded Jamaica Eye, and has been developed. I would expect, Prime Minister, that in St. James, as a state of emergency parish, there would be a rapid rollout of CCTV in just about all the major public spaces in St. James, so that young people, old people can go in Sam Sharp Square and all those areas, use their laptop and their smartphone and feel safe. The space that you have asked for the state, in the state of emergency, those are some of the things we expect you to seek to achieve, having gotten that space, so that people can feel safe in these areas. Why is it, Mr. Prime Minister, that we don't see any concrete steps being taken in these directions? Why is it that these doable things, these low-hanging fruits, are not being dealt with? I believe, Mr. Prime Minister, that if we can deal with some of those together, you, the opposition, us as a state, it will go a far way in restoring the sense and feeling of safety by the ordinary persons in those communities. So, Mr. Prime Minister, in this last go, I hope it's the last go, that we will, yes, and I'm going to keep on saying it until we get there. Until we get there, I would want, Mr. Prime Minister, in this next go, that it will be the last go. But during the time, during this last go, those things will be put in place, among others, which have been spoken of earlier on, so that some normalcy can return for everybody and not just some in that space. Security must not be for some, it must be for all. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister. Oh. Dr. Ferguson.
Mr. Speaker, colleagues, it would appear abnormal for one coming out of St. Thomas, coming out of Portland, or even going around St. Mary in these, to want to speak on this occasion relative to crime. But if we look at crime in context, Mr. Speaker, and the debate and discussions that are taking place here today, the fact is, in St. Thomas last year, we had 13 murders up to this time. Today, very unusually, today we are experiencing 15 murders to date. In relation to shooting, we had 7 up to this time. Today we have about 9. In relation to robbery, we had about 6 up to this time in 2017. Now we have about 10. No, starting from January to now, comparing time. So if you look at it in that context, you would say, well, St. Thomas is doing well. But you would note that in St. Thomas, Portland, and even St. Mary, the nature of the murders, who are being killed, is of moment. And so we too, the question of the ballooning effect, the question of how, with what is taking place in the West, and how you might find the movement, some of these areas that we are not looking at. And we're not saying that you are to pull people from because to come to St. Thomas. I'm not arguing that case. I am putting on the table that we have to be careful in these areas. And while we are careful in that sense, we have to now take on board some of the issues. My intervention today is focused on reduce revenue for the local economy in St. James. if you look at it in context, there are, we will say and argue, how much can we sacrifice? I think the opposition is very clear that you have to spend and make the sacrifice to control and contain crime. We have no problem with that. But I support the leader of the opposition in relation to, are we going to normalize the state of emergency? Let us look at it. To date, it is costing us $30.8 million a month.
For just the JCF.
For just the JCF. We have spent in the region of $185 million since January. Projected to become $370 million by the end of December.
Just the JCF.
Remember now we're talking about the JCF in St. James. We're not talking about the country. And therefore, the sustainability of this, without at the same time giving the country some indication of what are the other strategies, and we are sensitive to what you can tell the country and what you can't. But it is clear to me that the intent is to come here for us to keep extending as an opposition because we are sensitive to the country or the opposition, the government saying that it was the opposition that never supported it, and therefore this is why crime. But what is there in St. James at this time cannot be sustained. It does not require rocket science to see that at $30.8 million a month in an economy such as this, what will happen? But my plea today, Prime Minister, is the little people. And we will say they too must make the sacrifice. But let us look at it. In the context of business, there are some businesses that are too big to fail. And so we will protect them even in St. James, whether it is the hotel industry or a Sumfest that we all enjoy. But what about the taxi man? What about the bus man? What about the round robin, which is now the partner, like a partner for a lot of persons across this country? All that I am asking for, Prime Minister, is that if we are to cooperate, then we must see that the opposition in putting forward our arguments, that it is taken seriously. It is not asking too much of a government to look at how do we, because when you curtail the movement, we understand why. But you're operating in a tourism belt. When you cut that transport, when a person have to would normally be making money, but now you can't move late. What about the gas station operators who have to close early? There are persons who deliver, coming from Kingston, have to go through Montego Bay to Negril. If they get there and have a gas problem at a certain time, again your logistics would be out. I am saying, Prime Minister, that we can talk and we are looking at the thing. We recognize you are major crimes down by 191. Fine. Great achievement. Your murder is down by 50-something%. Great. All I am saying, we need a deal for the little man and little woman who is operating in these circumstances. And I don't believe that if you look at it without creating any major harm, we would be able to look at, is it that some gas stations can open beyond you do a shift system, you know, or I'm just putting that, don't let us get let us not argue that we get the results of reducing crime. But when it is over, you wipe out small and medium-sized business. You wipe them out completely. Because they can't go beyond if we continue at the same rate. I know in my constituency, I don't know others, round robin is a major thing. And therefore, I am saying, Prime Minister, what we are asking for is reasonableness as you ask for the cooperation of the opposition.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker.
Go ahead, sir.
I wanted to lend my support to the Leader of the Opposition, but to raise something else, Prime Minister.
Let your mic is working, please. Both of them.
Both are working. This one isn't. You want me to speak from this one?
Good now.
All right. Prime Minister, I wanted to raise another point in the dialogue. And those are for the persons under 18 years old. Because one of the dynamics I think that we've always missed is the toxicity and adverse effect that violence has on the minds of children. The statistics show over time, international statistics, even the ones here, that children who have behavior disorders, are not performing well in school, are in abusive situations, lead to other kind of health issues. What is happening now is that somehow there is a gap in the dialogue where we talk about fixing these parts of crime, but we're not looking at the long-term impacts of how we fix the other aspects of it. A criminal is not born overnight. And somebody doesn't get up one morning and decides to shoot someone, maim another person. I've seen firsthand young people, 15, in my own constituency. I go to the police station and I speak to them. And the parents don't know when they got to that stage. It was almost as if they did GSAT, graduated, went to high school, took up some bad company. Something else might have been going on. Maybe there was no father figure at home. Maybe they had a falling out with their mother. They're just different things. But at some point in that young person's life, something snaps. There's a lot of snapping going on in Jamaica. Whether it is from post-traumatic stress, whether it is from young people desiring attention from an adult or a role model, mentorship. Sometimes there's not enough resources, but we're missing them. And I want to make a suggestion, because when I was at another place, we had left in place, and I heard the minister announce it in his sectoral, for the child facility to deal with counseling for young people under 18 years old, where they can go, because we don't have one of those facilities. But we also don't have enough psychologists, health guidance clinics in rural areas in particular, where young people feel comfortable to go and have someone they can speak to about stress, where we have interventions at the community level. And the social intervention programs are different. That's not what I'm speaking about. There are actually a lot of issues relating to toxicity and post-traumatic stress in young people. And Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, for instance, who we brought down to train, who has a wellness clinic in California and who looks and tracks at the impact on your primary healthcare services, if you don't address it, you have to address that part of the healthcare system, because what you're going to be doing if you don't do it is you're going to continue to have these kinds of state of emergencies. I'm sure that if you brought the ages of the young people or the persons in these gangs, you would say that they're under 30 years old. So we need to address, for those of us who have children in this parliament, we need to address how it is that we're going to see every child in this country as our own child. Because we have a responsibility to every single child in this country. They're ours. We legislate their lives. So let us try and figure out how we address that kind of behavioral, mental issue. And there has to be a health component that is placed in your security plan going forward. I'd like to suggest that you pull your team of education, health, call in a council of psychiatrists and psychologists. There are a number of social workers out there and child guidance psychologists. There are students coming out of UTech, and put a team together and have it now so that young people actually have a mechanism that they can start with, and then put in place a systematic approach to deal with young people and also children with learning disabilities. Many of them go to school and don't matriculate because they have a learning disability. They're teased, they're abused, the teachers don't have patience for them. And if you ask many of the people in prison and some in the jails, which I have spoken to, how you reach here, they will tell you some awful and horrific stories of when they went to school and what a teacher or a student said to them, that them dunce, them damn no sense, when in point and fact, they just had a learning disability. So there's some other things, Prime Minister, that we have to look for. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, permission to speak from a seat other than my own.
Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wanted to make a couple of very brief points. I don't know how many of us remember that some time ago while we were having a similar discussion and the issue of the small business operators came up. There were some individuals who were actually saying that many of them are scammers. So I'm pleased to know that where we are today, we seem to have arrived at a consensus that recognizes their vulnerability and that we have a willingness to address it. Go look. The Prime Minister said that he did not want to be distracted by every little flare-up. I'm not sure if I understand what that means. I am hoping, I don't want him to be distracted, but I certainly want to ensure that the residents of St. Andrews South, that there is a strategic plan to deal with reducing crime in their areas. I also want to make sure that the residents on that Mountain View Strip also that there is a strategic plan to deal with them, and for Augustown, and for Rockford. So yes, don't be distracted, but I want to make sure that when their blood is running, they know that there are individuals who care and who are going to pay some attention. Having said that, Mr. Speaker, I think the Prime Minister spoke about the need for a long-term strategy, which really is what we have been asking for. That rather than coming and dealing with the state of emergencies and with the ZOZOs, that we see what that long-term strategy is. If it was as clear as that, for example, the member from Southeast St. Anne would not have to speak about a multi-sector approach to dealing with crime when it comes to our children. It is because we don't see where that is that there's a need to actually articulate that. The opposition leader spoke about the number of officers, which is really what I want to talk about today. Spoke about the number of officers that are engaged in the state of emergency. I heard someone say, just listen. I heard someone say after he was finished that that was his weakest argument. And therefore, I want to speak a little bit more about it. When he was finished, I thought that the point had been made. But since that there are obviously individuals who still believe that it is a weak argument, I want to make sure that we do not lose sight of what is at stake. The beautiful progress, Prime Minister, of which you spoke and which you illustrated through graphs, pictures, and all of that about what is happening in St. James is taking place. But there is a sacrifice that is being made that we are not talking about. And that sacrifice is on the backs of our men and women in the security forces. So when we talk about making sure that they have incentives, making sure we settle the issue of salary, that's part of what we're talking about. But that is not all, because the number, that 500, 600 officers that we're talking about, that I think it was the Minister of National Security says that we have always had that kind of a problem where we have moved at large numbers to deal with crime in specific areas. I want to remind us that we have not always had them with that same level of rotation, because the current rotation that we have is a tremendous strain on these men and women. I am concerned about the impact of those long hours and the rotation, both physically and mentally. Both physically and mentally. I am concerned about their families, their wives, their husbands, their children. I am concerned about what it is doing to them. And I don't hear in the discourse the attention that I believe it deserves. They are tired. They are tired. We're looking at police burnout. And that those keen eyes that I think was the Prime Minister spoke about, how the officers were paying close attention. He spoke about the searches and so on. Pretty soon, they will not be able to do it at that same level because of burnout if we don't take care of that part of it. The truth is that I was extremely pleased to see the inclusion of the monies that we have secured that can go to putting into what we're doing with security so that it can be beefed up. Extremely pleased. I'm pleased because I sat here and I was saying to myself, you know, all the last 2 weeks we have been talking about Petroscam. And I'm thinking about what some of those resources could have done. I'm thinking about the cars that it could have bought for the police, the data gathering equipment that it could have also procured. I'm also thinking that we actually do need more boots on the ground. We need more boots on the ground because if we had more boots on the ground, we would also be able to ease the pressure that the rotation is causing on these 800 or so, 600 to 800 individuals who we have there. We would be able to improve to keep the standard. I'm not paying the man. I'm an MP on duty 24/7. 24/7. Mr. Prime Minister, it is important because the pressure that we see on these officers also mean that in other areas there is a gap. That's what it means, because we have a finite number. I know, for example, because I was at Hunts Bay Police Station on Saturday, where I met a family who had a son that had been missing now for 7 days. Their concern was that, yes, the police had been doing a tremendous job in terms of cooperating with them, listening to them, but what is needed when they get a tip? The police said, "Boy, we have been to so many tips. We have gone out on that search. We have gone out on another search." They say, "I don't know how much longer I can keep going out to search for your son who is missing and who is feared dead." They just don't have the resources to do that. Because at the same time, they're contending with that lady that was killed and buried in a shallow grave on Delacree Lane. I was there with the husband in tears, with the son and daughter in tears. Sat there for about 3 or 4 hours just listening to them pour out their soul in terms of how it is affecting them. How it is affecting them. The police, of course, as they're doing, they're saying, okay, when do we go in to have that kind of community meeting? They are searching for that day for the one for Payne Avenue. But they have scheduled one for up at the border between you and I by Chester Avenue. So that one is on stream. They're looking to do another one again down in Union Gardens to make sure that everything is okay. So what that means is that all is fine and dandy in St. James. And we're not suggesting it's everywhere, but there are some other areas where we are concerned about what is happening. And we believe that more resources are required to allow our officers to do a much better job. And I want us to be clear, because when we talk about what is not happening, we are not saying that the men and women are not doing a fantastic job. With the resources that they have, they are doing a fantastic job, but more needs to be done for them. We want to make an appeal that when they're out there, as you said earlier, and they have our backs, that they know that we have their backs, that they know that the incentives, that is going to be settled soon, that we have a commitment to do that because we understand the sacrifice that they are making, the welfare of our officers. I don't care who else wants me to shut up. I want to make sure that the point is well made about the welfare of our officers, the welfare of our men and women, because they are the ones keeping us safe. And they're doing it at extreme sacrifice to themselves and to their families. And the least that they deserve from us is to know that their welfare has our undivided attention. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And settle their wages, settle their wages, settle their wages.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I won't detain the House much longer, but just to give quick responses to the questions that were raised and issues raised as well. Start with the member from St. Anne regarding dealing with violence. Mr. Speaker, central to all of this is the epidemic of violence which is affecting our island. We have to treat it in that way. It is an epidemic, and we almost have to use epidemiology in the response because it is almost a virus. Well, violence is a virus, and it has basically infected a large part of our population. To that end, Mr. Speaker, I have spoken to various experts in the field, particularly dealing with children and dealing with restorative justice and dealing with early interventions in violence. And as I had announced before, we will be putting together a special commission to look at how we can use government policy to address violence. So I'm very sympathetic to the issues raised by the member from St. Anne. Mr. Speaker, the opposition spokesman on national security lamented that in the state of emergency in St. James, we detained over 2,000 young Jamaicans. Mr. Speaker, that is the case. We detained over 2,000 persons of interest, not on frivolous grounds. It was based on intelligence. And that, Mr. Speaker, was done within the first 2 months of the state of emergency. Since the expiration of the first 2 months, Mr. Speaker, the level of detentions have been almost negligible. So the tool of detentions were only used in the very first phase of the state of emergency. And since then, we have not used that tool generally. No, well, Mr. Speaker, let's be clear, and I don't want to prolong my response, but I just thought that I would mention that it is not an ongoing practice that every single day we are scraping up 2,000 youngsters and throwing them in jail. That is, as the leader of the opposition said, what he said, statistics, lies, damn lies and statistics. Exactly. You don't have to say. And that's what giving the impression is. You don't say. But obviously, by lamenting on that fact, you would communicate to the rest of the public that somehow, every single day, the police forces and the military are scraping up innocent Jamaicans. Well, you could have clarified. I am clarifying your statement. Now, Mr. Speaker, the truth is that the police force is not relying wholly and solely on the ability to detain, but it has been very effective, particularly against the gangs. And even though the statistics say only 25 persons are known members of gangs, 20 rather, it doesn't mean that those that they have detained are not. It's just that they have not been able to verify. And in fact, the operations, Mr. Speaker, have been targeted mostly at gangs. Mr. Speaker, the other point that should be made, and made with some strength, is that the government is not seeking to bring peace to St. James while somehow allowing St. Andrew South and St. Andrew Southwestern while allowing other areas to perish at the hands of criminals. That is not the intention of the government, Mr. Speaker. The government targeted St. James because, as I had shown, St. James created an exceptional problem with more than 300 murders in a year. That strategy, Mr. Speaker, has worked. It has displaced gang members. It has weakened the gangs. We have now started the process of putting together cases for the masterminds, a strategy which must run parallel. Mr. Speaker, the opposition spokesman on national security asked, what are the benchmarks? What is it that we are seeking to achieve? Well, Mr. Speaker, you can't in any way diminish the value of reducing murders. You can't diminish that. But that is not the only key performance indicator. What we want to achieve, Mr. Speaker, is sustained peace in communities. A point that needs to be said, Mr. Speaker, is that every single murder portends another murder. I don't want that point to escape us in this house. Every murder has the potential for at least one retaliation. When every murder, Mr. Speaker, has the potential for at least one retaliation, whenever there is a murder, you can expect that that murder will have an impact. If it doesn't at this year's murder rate, it will have an impact on the murder rate next year. And therefore, whenever we see murders spiraling, the state has to intervene to stop that. Mr. Speaker, we are looking for a sustained decrease in murders. And that means we have to cut off the opportunity of criminals to commit murders, controlling the space. We have to cut off their capabilities, Mr. Speaker, to commit murder, which means making it difficult for them to use their guns and capturing their weapons and cutting off their supplies. Mr. Speaker, I just got some good news today. On your screen, Mr. Speaker, is a weapon that was just confiscated, discovered and taken away from criminals in Salt Spring at 4 p.m. today. We can't say definitively, this is in the state of emergency, we can't say definitively, but if you look closely at the weapons, the video that I showed earlier, you would see that it is a similar weapon as one that was shown in the video. No, well, it was actually, this is the M16. Yes. So, and it's similar to the one showed. I can't say it is the same, but it is similar. And the police, the military has just sent me this to say that they have recovered. Because as I said, Mr. Speaker, we are serious. We are serious about sending a message to these criminal gangs that we are going to disarm them. Whatever it takes, we are going to disarm them. So, Mr. Speaker, the member asks about what is it that we are trying to do. This is what we are trying to do. Take away the capacity for them to create mayhem. The bigger problem, however, as all members will agree, Mr. Speaker, is the intent. There is very little that security forces can do regarding the intent to violence, other than being a credible deterrent by virtue of their presence and their investigative abilities. Mr. Speaker, dealing with the intent is what the member from Westmoreland, from St. Anne, forgive me, from Southeast St. Anne spoke about. This growing acceptance of violence and the growing use of violence and how it is affecting our young people. So, Mr. Speaker, I want the House to appreciate that the government considers all the positions put forward by the opposition. The truth is that the member from St. Thomas Eastern would know that we responded to the complaints about opening times and inconvenience as it relates to the North St. Catherine state of emergency. As it relates to the state of emergency in St. James, we considered it carefully and we created a special district so that every man, big man, small man, will benefit from that special zone around the music festival. So, Mr. Speaker, we are very sensitive, like you are, that we don't want to take away people's livelihood. That's not what we want to do. So we are very sensitive, and I want to assure you that we are working to ensure that people's livelihoods are secure. Mr. Speaker, with those remarks, I encourage the House to support the extension of the state of emergency.
We are putting the question and we have to record each person. So those in favor will say aye and we will record, and those. So I put the question. Those in favor? Not you. We're going to record your each person.
Mr. Arscott, Mr. Azan, Mr. Bartlett, Dr. Bloomfield, Dr. Bloomfield, absent. Mr. Brown, Dr. Brown-Burke, Mr. Buchanan, Mr. Bunting, Dr. Campbell, Mr. Campbell, Dr. Chang, Mr. Chuck, Mr. Clark, Dr. Clark, Mrs. Cuthbert Flynn, Miss Daly, not here, Miss Daly. You have to listen to your name. Mr. Daly, Mrs. Dalrymple Philibert, Mrs. Dalrymple Philibert, Dr. Dunn, Mr. Fagan, Mr. Fagan, Dr. Ferguson, Mr. Golding, Miss Grange, Mr. Green, Dr. Guy, Ms. Hannah, Mr. Hales, Mr. Henry, Mr. Holness, Mrs. Holness, Mr. Hutchinson, Mr. Hilton, Mr. Jackson, Mr. Kelly, Mrs. Malahufort, Mr. Main,
Silent, please.
Mr. Mackenzie, Dr. McNeil, Mr. Montague, Ms. Nita, Mr. Paulwell, Mr. Phillips, Dr. Phillips, Mr. Pickersgill, Mr. Redmond, Mr. Robertson, Mr. Robinson, Mr. Robinson, Mrs. Robinson, Mr. Samuda, Mr. Shaw, Mr. Spencer, Mr. Stewart, Mr. Terry Long, Reverend Thwaites, Dr. Tufton, Mr. Darrell Vaz, Mr. Dwayne Vaz, Mr. Warmington, Dr. Wheatley, Mrs. Williams, Mr. Witter, Mr. Wright, anybody? Mr. Pickersgill, anybody else? Mr. Speaker,